So, Asha, what exactly does the jury need to find in order to determine that Donald Trump is guilty of a felony in this case?
Yeah, it's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Renato, for anyone who's listening, we are taping this podcast as the jury is deliberating. The closing arguments concluded, and we're basically waiting for them to come back. And all day there's been all kinds of speculation and disinformation about what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a few drinks. We've been waiting for this verdict. Asha's drinking wine. For the first time, I've had more drinks than you, Asha. But we've been having some drinks, waiting for something to happen. No for jury verdict today. I will tell you, Asha, I am not surprised at all. And, typically, I would say, trial lawyer or shorthand, usually expect that the jury's going to take 1 hour to deliberate per full day of testimony. And there was a lot of days of testimony, right? This was like a 5-week trial. What was it? Something like that?
It's been a long time. Okay, so I was kind of hoping that this would all be wrapped up by Friday.
Maybe. It may. But, I mean, this case is really complicated. And one thing that didn't help was the lawyers deciding that they wanted to talk on and on and on and have, an entire day of closing arguments. I mean,
those were long. That was I think the defense gave a 2.5 hour closing argument, and then the prosecution gave a 3-hour closing argument, something like that.
Yeah, that was bad lawyering. And I'll say that. I mean, I'm happy to affirmatively say that. I mean, it is never a good idea to talk that long if you're trying a case. It just isn't. Anyone who thinks that they need 3 hours to make an argument in a case is just not a good enough lawyer to get it down to, 1. The reality is jurors don't like hearing lawyers drone on. And you would be far better picking your greatest hits and synthesizing the case. It's much harder to do a 1 hour closing than it is a 3-hour closing. It's easy to just have a diarrhea of the mouth and say everything that comes to mind. But while there were some good moments on both sides, I would give the defense team, Trump's team, maybe a B, and the prosecution team maybe a B+. I just don't think you ever are doing a great job if you're taking that long to close.
Yeah, I trust your grading schema. I will say in reading it, I shout out to Anna Bauer. You recommended her tweet thread to me, and I read, she was incredibly detailed, and I felt like I could kind of hear the argument as I was reading it. And it did feel to me that the defense closing was much more disjointed and meandering and kind of all over the place. I do feel like it seemed like, even though the prosecution's closing may have been long, they seem to be more systematic in terms of having almost a more linear way of approaching the evidence. So to giving the jurors a way of organizing all the information that they heard into what they needed to decide. That was my impression reading it.
That's right. I mean, first of all, and I agree. I mean, I think I was the one who recommended to you. She did a great job. There are a few others who were also tweeting, but I thought her tweets were incredibly detailed, and her hands must have been ready to fall off after a whole day of typing that out on her phone or whatever she's doing. But in all seriousness, I think that part of that is due to the different roles that the prosecution and the defense have. The prosecution, of course, they're the ones who wrote the indictment. They're marshaling the evidence. They're gathering the witnesses. Of course, they're going to have a systematic story that they're telling. It's their trial. The defense, by its nature, is trying to poke holes in the prosecution case. But I will say, in my experience, having tried a lot of cases, both on the prosecution side and on the defense side, The defense usually loses unless they have a powerful counter narrative of their own. The most powerful defense cases are where you have a coherent counter narrative, and they didn't have it here. And just to preview a piece that I'm going to have coming out in the New York Times, maybe it's already out by the time you're listening to this. To me, the defense adopted a Trumpian strategy. It probably is Trump's idea. I don't know.
To deny everything.
Deny everything.
That was
Attack
so dumb.
everything.
It was so dumb.
It was so dumb. Oh, let's deny that they had sex. Let's deny that it's hush money payments. I mean, the hilarious thing, Asha, is when they're trying to say it was all payment for legal services. Even the money that Cohen embezzled was apparently a payment for legal services. Does that make any sense?
No.
No, it was just absurd, right? And so I think it meant that you had to have a 3-hour closing because they basically had to walk through everything that they saw in the case and fight about everything. And that was a very foolish move. And then on the flip side, the prosecution felt like they had to address every point and, cross every T and dot every I. And I don't think they needed to do that either. But there were some fantastic zingers in the closings, don't get me wrong, but I think that was why we saw the closings we did.
Well, I think the prosecution was really trying to, emphasize that they did not need to rely only on Michael Cohen to be able to convict. That was their thing. And so they were trying to, I think, focus the jury's attention on all of this other evidence, other testimony, the documents, etc., to say, listen, this whole thing tells a story. And also, P.S., if Cohen was going to lie to you, he would have lied to you about much bigger stuff, like the stuff, he could have told some whoppers, he wouldn't have said, it conceded XYZ. And so I thought overall, to me, I'm a linear thinker. And so I could just follow the prosecution more. Now, let's talk about the law, though, because I've been on Twitter today. I've been tweeting my diagram to Marco Rubio because he has been a vector of disinformation. So following the jury instructions, there's been a whole line of disinformation about this idea that somehow Judge Merchan said that the jury does not need to be unanimous in order to convict Trump. And, that's not entirely true in terms of the actual charged offenses. And so, just to recap, and I think we've covered this in previous episodes for most people who've been listening, but just to recap, Trump has been charged with New York Penal Law 175-10, which is falsification of business records with the intention to conceal, it's a stepped up from the misdemeanor, falsifying business records in the first degree with the intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission thereof. So, Renato, the prosecution, to prove this case, to prove the charges against Trump, they have to, the elements here, which are the pieces that they need to actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt, is that Trump falsified or caused to falsify business records, and that he did so with the intention to commit another crime. On those 2 points, there needs to be unanimity. Would you agree with that?
There you go. That's the gist. Is this complicated? The answer is yes.
Yeah. What I thought the analogy to me was super helpful was actually New York has a burglary statute that is to this effect, but if you commit a burglary, and I don't know if it's a felony bump up or not, but it's that's one crime. If you basically trespass on a property and illegally enter. But if you do so to commit another crime, then it becomes a more stringent offense, a separate crime. And I'm just thinking, like, and I think in that context, it makes it easier to understand. Like, you could imagine a jury that says, well, I think he came in to take the jewelry. And somebody's like, well, I think he came in to steal the car. And then somebody else is like, I think he came in to take the drugs or to sexually assault one of the people. But they're all agreeing that the person came in to do something else that was not legal. Like, not that the person just came in to get out of the snow and have a soft place to sleep on the couch. Like, that to me is kind of a good analog of where there can be disagreement among the jurors, even though there's unanimity on what the intention was of coming in.
That's a fair point. And one thing I will say is, the fact of the matter is this is somewhat unsettled under New York law, in that I don't think we've had a case quite like this one that was litigated that's potentially going to be appealed on this very statute, on this very issue. This burglary statute you're talking about, there has been.
Yeah. No, it's
more straightforward. There's been, it's more litigated. So is there a chance that this could all get undone on appeal? Perhaps. Although I don't know how much it matters. I mean, we're in the middle of a presidential election. If Trump's found guilty, that's a big deal. He's a convicted felon. Judge can go right ahead and sentence him. Under New York law, you don't have to. It's not like federal law. So in federal court, where I usually practice, the sentencing could take a long time. It doesn't always have to be that way. So we could potentially have a sentence in the middle of this election season, which would really be something. So, regardless of the, ultimately how this shakes out in a court of appeal. I mean, I do think we need to take a step back here. I mean, there has been a trial of the president of the United States, a former president of the United States, potentially future president of the United States, and it's completed. It went off, I would say, almost pretty much without a hitch. I mean, no jurors felt intimidated. There's 12 jurors. There's 6 alternates. This is happening. And whether there's a verdict by the time you listen to this or not, or if there isn't, ultimately not a verdict, which you could talk about, this is, in my mind, a successful exercise of the criminal justice system in the state of New York.
Yeah, I thought you tweeted that today, and I thought that was a really profound point, and I hope it doesn't get lost in people wanting to see a particular outcome, because, and I've said this before in other contexts, like impeachment, like I think process matters, and I think there is a lot to be said for the ability to follow through. And I was earlier, before we got on this podcast, Renato, I was speaking at a kind of a event for the new mayor of Hartford, who's South Asian sided. But anyway, we were talking about democracy, and someone asked me a question and said, well, what do you think it means if Trump is acquitted? And I said, well, I think it means that the system worked. Like it worked this was his trial, there is an opportunity here. You may be disappointed in the outcome, but as a rule of law society, what we do is we accept jurors' verdicts, even when they don't come out in our favor. And I think there's an opportunity there, especially if he's acquitted. I don't think he should be, but I'm not on the jury. Especially if he's acquitted, to say, this is exactly how the system works. And he got his day in court, and this is why defendants are given due process. I don't know, like that. I know people don't love that, but I do think that process piece is really important to emphasize.
Well, I love that. I mean, look, I think that's how the process is supposed to work. And, I've said on this podcast multiple times now that if you were the defendant and I was the lawyer on the defense side, we would have an acquittal or some sort of successful, either a misdemeanor or a non-jury or something. But I think if Trump is acquitted with this presentation, like the defense totally screwed up how they tried this case. If he gets an acquittal here, for a jury in Manhattan unanimously decides he's not guilty after this bad piece of lawyering on his defense, then wow, okay. I mean, that means something. Boy, you could really get a fair trial in the United States of America, at least if you're Donald Trump. So I think that's I think that is what it is. I think the reality is, and I'm saying this without knowing what the verdict's going to be, I think this is either going to be a conviction or a hung jury. There supposedly are a couple jurors that the Trump team is excited about that seem like they're skeptical of the prosecution, and we'll see what happens. I would be surprised if there's 12 jurors in Manhattan who see the way this case has been lawyered and find the defense case so compelling that they unanimously decided to quit it.
Yeah, so why don't we go through the alternatives? So to acquit, no one bites.
I mean, look, the way to an acquittal here would have been, as I've
just
said,
the government did not prove their case. They didn't meet their burden.
You would have had to have a much more focused case. Here,
yeah.
Where if you stipulated to outweigh everything else and just said, okay, the whole question is, did Donald Trump know that did he cause these false business records? Did he actually cause someone to do it? Where we see accomplice in that? I think you very well could get reasonable doubt, because that's the standard here, beyond reasonable doubt, around whether or not Michael Cohen and Alan Weisselberg, who, by the way, are both convicted liars and convicted fraudsters, whether they just did that themselves. I mean, I think you'd have a compelling defense case to be made there. But, FYI, no one made that case. I mean, it was some gestures along those lines were made in the middle of this 2.5-hour closing, but it was lost in a sea of ballast, as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot of nonsense.
I was just about to say that. Like, he glossed over some pieces of evidence that really could have focused on that. Like, Trump was in the White House. He was off doing other stuff. And they had to go to, like, Eric and, what's his brother's name? Don Jr. to get permission. In other words, there were things that pointed to this idea that, like, Trump couldn't be bothered with the stuff. Like, they could have really
focused on the details. He's not a details guy. He's a big picture guy.
He's a big picture guy. He's not in the weeds on, like, who pays the invoices and with the ledgers that they get recorded in. I mean, I'm not even a prosecutor or defense lawyer, and I feel like that would be obvious to me that you need to hammer that. But I agree with you that in reading this long meandering defense, it was like almost a throwaway piece of it. And I was shocked kind of as I was reading it. I was like, why didn't they humor on that for longer?
It's the thing. If you talk, I mean, I'm sure we've all been in these circumstances where you've been on the phone with somebody and they won't get off the phone, and you just go on and on and on. And you're like, oh my God, like, you're just looking at your phone, you're like, how much longer will they go? Or you're on a Zoom, endless Zoom for work, and you're like, when will this end? That must have been the jury during this closing argument. Like, oh my God, let's wrap it up, and you just lose the important points when that happens. The jury's eyes glaze over. It's just hard. Any human being, if you hear too many points, you're not going to remember any specific detail that much. So I think that was that's the only way the defense gets to an acquittal.
But your point is that there was at least a theoretical path to acquittal had they been surgical and focused and disciplined and willing to concede, like, yeah, man, this happened. Like, kind of like SFW.
100%. I mean, so what? Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the path that I just suggested is the best. Okay, that would have been the best path for them. There's a secondary path where they focus on the unlawful means portion of it, and they say, hey, look, he did this for all sorts of reasons, but it wasn't the election's already over. Was he really promoting his election in 2016 by this action in 2017? They could have done that. It's more complicated. I think the first point I made was better. But even then, I will just say, as somebody who's actually tried cases against the government, in my experience, jurors want to believe prosecutors, and they assume that if you're indicted, that you must have done something wrong. So it's just the reality of it. There's so much of this presumption of innocence. There's a presumption of guilt in a lot of people's minds. So I would have not only been trying for a hung jury, but I would have given the jury a misdemeanor option. Like, another real head scratcher here was,
we talked about
last episode. We were like, we're not 100% sure because you don't know the jury instructions yet. But now, Asha, we know the jury instructions, and the defense decided that this is their bright idea. Was like, let's go for broke, felony or nothing, right? And it's like, okay, it's just, to me, a lot of hubris to not give the jury this option to say, well, maybe it was just a misdemeanor, because then I think if Trump gets out with a misdemeanor, you just declare victory. Absolutely declare victory.
Yeah. Then you can really be like, it was a bookkeeping error.
Yeah. So there's just some misdemeanor. I mean, there's all this hoopla, round the clock coverage for a misdemeanor. Come on now. I mean, yeah.
So, okay. So that ship sailed. You think you're pretty confident this is not going to be an acquittal. I agree with you. So then let's go to a hung jury. And we talked about this before. So where do you think the vulnerability is here for that? This is the holdout juror. This is the 1 or 2 jurors you said who just aren't buying the cheese.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say, I mean, one thing is, we're recording this right now on Wednesday evening. So it's just been one day of deliberations, but I wouldn't be surprised if this goes 2 or 3 days. One thing that I will say is, in my experience, jurors want to arrive at a verdict, and they try to arrive at a verdict. Jurors don't typically go back there and just are like, F it, like, we're done. Like, oh, we disagree, we did a vote, we're on different sides, okay, we're done. Because they've been sitting there for a while, they feel invested in it, and the judge makes a big deal about how they need to, like, listen to each other and talk. And they feel indebted. They feel like they need to follow the judge's instructions. They usually like the judge. They want to do their part for the judge. That's just the reality. And if they come back, by the way, and say, we can't make up our minds, the judge is going to give them this plain vanilla instruction that's like, please try again. Try harder, okay? And they'll go back, and this will happen a couple times. So if this happens, what it means is that there's some people in the jury who just feel very strongly one way or the other. And I think most likely in this scenario, I have trouble believing in Manhattan, given the way this case was tried, this scorched earth nonsense, attack everyone defense from the Trump team. I think it's unlikely that you're going to have more jurors that not want to acquit. Okay. I've been in a situation, by the way. I had a case that I tried where 10 of them wanted to acquit my client and only 2 wanted to convict. Okay. And that's part of my view of like, well, people just come in wanting to acquit because there was like no evidence in that case. But in this case, I think it's going to be most people want to convict. So who are the holdouts? Well, the holdouts could be the lawyers who sit there parsing the jury instructions and are trying to make sense of things. And the rest of the jury is like, come on. That's possible. There also could be 1 or 2 people who just like Trump and are just like, he's been persecuted, and they just feel bad for him, or they identify him in them in some way. And there's nothing you can do about that if the person's just not willing to engage with the rest of the jury.
So let me throw in a little, some cognitive psychology research here, because I think it's an interesting, because this is like some of the research that I teach when I'm talking about disinformation, is that, so one of the things that I focus on is when people have strong tribal loyalties, right? Like they have strong partisan loyalties, they filter information. There's cognitive bias in terms of how they filter information, because they're accepting things that conform with their worldview. They reject stuff that doesn't. And like, how do you counter that? And there are studies that show that when you appeal to people's civic mindedness, like when you appeal to like higher values or virtues, it kind of loosens some of that tribal, reasoning and loyalty. And I think a jury is kind of the perfect place. And some of the stuff that you were just saying, like the judge has told them, like, this is your civic duty. Like, you need to like really be open, and you need to listen to the evidence. Like, they are being primed to appeal to this like higher civic mindedness, this collective thinking. And so in my view, I think that to the extent that there might be jurors biased towards Trump, I think they may hold it more loosely than they do on Twitter. And we saw this even like in the Manafort case. Like, wasn't there like some like super MAGA person in the Manafort case? And he did get acquitted on some of those counts, or I can't remember if it was acquitted or if he was hung. I think it was hung on some of the counts, but he was convicted on several of them.
On almost all the counts.
So in Virginia, and in one of the trials, there was some that he...
Virginia.
But there was a total MAGA person on the trial. They were on the jury. And
Sure.
So, like, I think it's just an interesting... I just like to throw that out there because I think most people, may not know that there is this psychological thing that when you're kind of when you're feeling like a collective, which I think a jury does, and there's like a higher purpose, I wonder whether those partisan leanings, like people may be more willing to compromise on them.
Well, it's interesting, Asha. I will say that, in my experience, from my perspective, juries sometimes have a different kind of different characters depending on who's on them, and you're always worried when you're selecting a jury: are you going to get a leader who is the sort of person who's going to get everyone herded together into a verdict or not? And I think sometimes you end up with these juries full of followers and no leader, and then what ends up happening is a lot of disagreement. But I have seen, in my experience, there was, I was there during watching the first Blagojevich case, and there was a holdout who just was so into Blagojevich that she hung everything, all but one count, the false statement count. So anything's possible. We will have to say, maybe as you're listening to this, you already know, but at least you're getting our unvarnished reactions before the result.
And then, of course, to convict, we've already talked about what they need to all agree on.
Indeed. So, Asha, before we go, we're recording this podcast late in the evening, and why are we doing that again?
Well, I had like a 7-hour delay at Hartford to DC, which is just like, should be like a hop, skip, and a jump. Easy flight, get in. But there was weather in DC, and it was frustrating. We were sitting on the tarmac for a while, then rolled back to the gate, then got back on. I mean, I learned to tap into like my travel zen place where I just relax and accept whatever's happening. But this is why I'm sitting here in a hotel room and I have no makeup on and whatever. I don't care.
We don't do makeup on this podcast. You already determined that. I will say I definitely, as I've traveled more, I've been working more and more. My law practice has been growing, and I travel a lot now. And I definitely have gotten focused on how I can make the best use of that time. I definitely use those airport lounges to get work done. I find myself trying to find ways to do work on the plane using the airport or the Wi-Fi, and use different devices. I feel it's hard to get work done when you're just cramped in a flight, but I try to find ways to do that. But it can be inconvenient, and you could eat up your entire day.
Though Delta now has great Wi-Fi on its flights, which I have found to be incredibly conducive to productivity.
Okay, I'm an American person. Just because I think I'm from Chicago. I'm proud to be an American. No, but in all seriousness, I fly American, and it's just because in Chicago, United and American have this as a hub.
Yeah,
Delta does not. I feel like Delta is more of more southeastern.
It's Atlanta, Detroit. So let me ask you a question quickly about travel. How do you feel about packing? Do you find it easy to pack? Because I hate packing. I'll procrastinate on packing. I'll literally wait until an hour before I have to go to pack, and I don't know why. It's I get paralyzed as having to think through all of the stuff, and it's usually outfit coordination.
Yeah, because you're fashionable. You're in vogue. Okay, I mean, I wear the same crap every day. Everybody who watches this podcast on YouTube knows I wear the same black hoodie or blue hoodie all the time at home. I'm wearing the same jacket and shirt. I have these same jackets and shirts that I wear all the time. I'm at a crypto conference right now, and I'm the only guy in a jacket and a dress shirt because that's kind of I just wear the same stuff all the time. So it's super easy for me to pack. It's just like a 20-minute exercise. I always pack the same stuff every time. I'm super boring.
For me, it's my shoe game. That's what trips me up.
What? How many shoes do you bring on a trip?
Well, for this trip, I have 3.
Okay. I have my dress shoes and I have my gym shoes. Okay. And you have like a whole like different color coordinated options.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. Like, I have to make sure that the outfits match the shoes. And then I have to have like versatile outfits. Otherwise, like, I have to pack too many shoes.
Oh my God. Can't you wear just like black shoes that go with everything?
I don't know. Not really.
Wow. The birds and the
MSW Media.